Welcome back. You're listening to the Dynasty Market Watch, where yesterday's price is not today's price. We're presented by the Bulletproof family of podcasts. Today, we are talking Dynasty Startup Strategy. I'm joined, as always, by Brian O'Leary and Matt Davis.
Yeah, Todd, I don't want to interrupt you too quickly here, but I can't hold it in any longer. I'm super excited. I'm anxious. I know we just finished a startup, but doing all the research for the show today, I'm overly excited to try and kind of put some of the things that I kind of concluded, see if I can put them to action and not screw it up too bad. So yeah, I'm super excited for the show today for sure. If you can't tell.
Yeah, like you said, we just did a Dynasty startup. It seems like with a Dynasty startup, every time you do one, you kind of like pick up on new things that you want to try for the next time. And there's what you feel like you can perfect it the next time you do a Dynasty startup. So we're going to go through what our Dynasty startup principles are. We're going to go through trading in startups and how to know what is good value within those trades. And then we'll hit on the debate that is old as time. Do you go contender or do you go tank? Or do you try to thread the needle on your Dynasty startups? And then we'll get to the meat and potatoes, what everybody wants to really hear, what I think is probably the most exciting. We're going to talk about what is our strategy for this year? What are we doing in our startups over the next 6 months? So, Brian, without further ado, play that Fat Joe.
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
So we're going to lead it off with Matt here. So just to kind of reiterate what we're doing here. So we're talking Dynasty startup principles. And the way I would think about these principles are they're more like evergreen content. So you could hear these principles. My principles for today are the same as they were last year, the year before that. Obviously, they're developing over time and they're improving. But if I listen back to this podcast in a year from now, my principles will probably be pretty similar. It's more player agnostic, but I'm looking at what am I doing in the startup to put myself in the best chance to succeed. So we're going to go through what each of our principles are. Matt, you can lead us off.
Yeah, I mean, the first one that comes to mind, I think, is kind of a bedrock of almost every person who's done multiple leagues is I'm going to look to trade back. As soon as I'm on the clock, before I'm on the clock, I'm identifying, what slot I'm drafting from. Ideally, I'm going to know a little bit about the tendencies of my league mates. If I've been in a few leagues before them, who likes to trade up, who doesn't. I'd like to try and get a few extra future draft picks, draft capital when in any startup, whether I'm going win now or 1 year punt, it does not matter. It just keeps flexibility open. So looking to trade back is, the main one. It's probably an obvious one. The other thing I'm doing is, again, this might be a little obvious, but research the ADP, look at recent startups, ask your buddies if they have any examples of recent startups. So you have a good idea of when tier breaks start, when tier breaks end. Like if getting a, top 10 quarterback is a really important thing. You know when that last one usually goes.
So you bring up ADP. I think that's a really good one. It's like kind of like easy to overlook that one. I wasn't really thinking in terms of like looking at ADP, but that's something that I do within every draft. Like find the ADP and then kind of keep an eye on it. I don't want to be a prisoner to ADP, but it kind of does give you an idea of what others are drafting. And when you say ADP, you're not talking about what the sleeper ADP is, because the sleeper ADP is pretty much always jacked.
Right. We're talking like real life drafts. And the other thing before I pass it to Brian that I'll mention is once I'm on the clock for the first time, generally what I'm going to do is set a queue of at least 12 to 20 guys in order till the next time I pick. And that will give me an idea of, who's left. Or I'm not really a big trade up guy, but if there's only 5 guys left and 10 that I really want, and there's a huge tier break, that queue that I have set up will kind of give me an idea of when I will make an exception to that rule and look to trade up. Go ahead, Brian.
I think the queue thing is a really good idea. When I first started playing Dynasty, I would dump in tons and tons of guys like, oh, I don't want to forget about this player, or like, here's my sleeper pick for round 11 or whatever the case is. But I found after a while, because I did so many startups because I'm a sicko, that it would kind of cloud things up. And I think what you're explaining, Matt, is just like saying, hey, I picked now before my next pick, I want to do 11 or 12 guys in there that like I'll be happy with. And if it's only 8, maybe that's when I do trade up. And if it's like 15 or 16 or 17, that's when you might trade back. And like that's like a simplified tiering system, right?
Yeah. And the other thing I would say that you could use the Q for, like we had some startups that we were doing while the NFL playoffs were going on. So they were using like last year's ADP. And, you know, you have to kind of dig to find guys like McBride and Tank Dell and Puka, and like just so you don't forget about them, basically, because that's easy to do, even if you have a good idea of what the real life ADP is.
There's a draft that I did, I think 2 years ago, where it was like Cooper Kupp. It was before his explosion, so maybe it was 3 years ago. And we were doing in the offseason when it was still like jacked up sleeper ADP. This is just an easy example. And Cooper Kupp was like projected like round 5 or 6 or something like that. And I remember it was coming off of his unreal season. I got him in like round 3 or 4 with like a pretty sharp group that just kind of like forgot about him.
Yeah, it happens every draft, it seems like.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's kind of a nice segue into my couple principles that I always try, and sometimes it's easier said than done for this first one, but remaining flexible is for as long as possible in an actual both in your build and your game strategy, I think is a huge advantage. So if you walk into the draft and say, I'm going to win now, I'm shoving the chips in, that kind of pigeonholes yourself into like a certain spot that you might start reaching or pulling on guys that you don't necessarily like, or making moves that you're putting yourself in an uncomfortable, perilous situation. So for me, I always try and remain as flexible as possible so that you can read what your other league mates are doing as the draft's going on. So reading the room, I think in this sense, yes, it's a broad and sometimes a catch-all, but in this sense, reading the room is saying, hey, I see that Matt has win now player X, Y, and Z. I know he's probably not going rookie pick 108 here. He's probably going to take, a Devontae Adams type, or like when it's like a fringe one or the other. And then I might be able to extract some value because of that type of movement or knowledge. Of course, he could always,
or they might be willing to move their future, second round rookie pick, first round rookie pick.
And in general, like whether I'm thinking I'm going to be a contender or a rebuild, I don't like passing up on certain values. So like if Christian McCaffrey drops to round 4, I was planning on being a rebuild. I'm not going to take rookie pick 106 because it's a rookie pick over Christian McCaffrey or something like that, something crazy. I would, you can always get that value some other time. Like I'll trade Christian McCaffrey in season for an unreal haul, I would imagine. So like that type of stuff, that to me falls under the layer of flexibility as well. So that's one. And my second one I guess it seems kind of clear cut, but maybe some people aren't doing this. And for me, it opened the game up in terms of startups. I would go into a startup like thinking, how many guys do I think are worth a first round rookie pick or more? Like if we were in season, would I trade this guy for a rookie pick, future first? What that does for me, and I hope other people, if they're not doing this and they think about it a little bit, is that it kind of allows you to say, I don't know what, and we'll get into a little bit more of this later, but like startup pick 512, I don't know what that means. But if I can apply like, hey, that is this player that I view as a first and a second, it kind of allows me to trade how I normally and I'm more comfortable with trading, like player for player sort of thing. So it kind of helped me kind of gauge parameters of what startup picks were being, because the biggest issue I see is like a lot of people will trade startup picks not really knowing what it is, and all of a sudden they look back and they're like, oh my god, I just traded 3 or 4 things for a guy that I would have maybe paid one of those things for.
Okay, so you're saying kind of applying a rookie pick value to draft slots in a sense.
Yeah, like if we get to like ADP, we're talking about, and Zay Flowers is going in late 5th round. I definitely view him as more than just a standard blank rookie first round pick, right? So like that for sure is a scale. Then I can move back and say, okay, 605, do I think that's still worth a rookie first round pick? That sort of thing.
Okay. So, Matt, you had trading back and kind of understanding what the ADP is and kind of utilizing the queue for your upcoming picks. Brian, staying flexible, kind of an overarching idea, but I think we get the gist, and then kind of applying what those future rookie pick values are. So I've got 3 principles here. The first one's really simple. In the first 7-ish rounds, 8, I'm looking to draft players that I think are going to increase in value or increase ADP by next year. So what does that mean? I'm probably ending up in a lot of punts, most likely, and a lot of non-contender builds. So like in this previous draft I just did, I took Will Levis in round 8. So like I'm hoping that he can increase in value. So like increase in value year over year. So I'm not probably taking 29-year-old receivers in those first 6-7 rounds, most likely.
So let me interrupt you here, Todd, with a question. What about someone like Stephon Diggs that might be like artificially devalued right now because of a stretch that he had last season? Yes, he's older, but proven production. You know, everyone loves Josh Allen and the Bills offense in general for the most part. Is that someone that in 6 months he could be worth more than he is right now? He's not necessarily going to scale up for the next 3 years or something like that, but is that someone that's falling into your value gain?
Yeah, if it's something like where I'm drafting here in February and by like August, September, I think that they could increase value. For example, like if you mentioned CMC, he's going in the 4th round. By August redraft season, he's going in like probably the 3rd. Then yeah, that I would view that as like a value gain because you can always trade later. But ultimately, I'm trying to and I'm not. It's not necessarily like I want like a full round of value. I just don't want to take a loss in value is probably the better way of looking at it. Like I don't want to take Stephon Diggs in round 7, knowing that most likely next year he'll be like a round 9 player. Or, you know, I'm not gonna kind of like take the player out of it. So like maybe don't use Diggs, but just I don't want to take a guy that I know is gonna lose value.
Yeah.
I would much rather target maintaining or increasing value, which sounds simple, but I think a lot of players in those first 7 rounds are destined to lose value because of their age, because maybe they just had a peak season, whatever that is.
So I think that's probably one of the big differences that in your strategy between me and Brian. Like me and Brian, I think have no problem switching up to a win now build and taking Tyreek and CMC if the value's right, and if everyone if we see a lot of people around us fading these older players, you're not really looking to do that. You're mostly looking to either, and it doesn't even have to be a 1-year punt. You're either looking for a 1-year punt or just a young contender. You can contend with just a bunch of young guys. So you're doing that to keep your future flexibility open instead of almost using up the flexibility in the current draft, basically.
Yeah, because I think like what you see happen a lot is like, all right, let's say for example, I kind of thread the needle and you have like this perfect draft in a sense where things go right. You can a lot of times trade a back end first for a Devontae Adams or for a like even a Tyreek Hill type, maybe not Tyreek Hill, but like that 29, 30-year-old receiver that can go dominate for you, like a Keenan Allen. I can go trade. You can do that easily later in the year if I become a team that's really good. So like to me, if I'm getting Tyreek, I need to be completely win now, or I just think by the time you get into the season, those older guys, they immediately lose value on the trade market. Like you can't trade Tyreek for much more than like maybe you could trade him for like a couple late first or something. You're not getting anybody's early first.
I have some pushback there. Like and Tyreek is maybe like an outlier example, but to me, if I'm trying to trade for Tyreek in season, the person that I'm trying to trade with is saying, hey, he just had 150 yards and 2 touchdowns for me. You got to pay up the wazoo. Where right now they're thinking, hey, how old is he again? They're trying to like optimize their lineup for in August for November. So I could see like the flip side. I totally get what you're saying, Todd. And I know that is like kind of a principle difference that we have in general. And there's no right or wrong way, I don't think either. But like there is different value points in different parts of the season for sure. I guess that's the overarching take that I have.
Yeah, I think that older players probably are more overvalued in season. Like the difference between if we're looking at winning, we talked about this later in the year, like trading Tyreek Hill. David Plout came on and he talked about trading Tyreek Hill for Chris Olave. I don't think that ultimately changed anything for his team. I think we're in the playoffs. So like, give me Chris Olave,
the variance.
Give me the wide receiver in the 12 to 18 range instead of Tyreek Hill. I just don't think it's meaningful. Those points are as meaningful as we want them to be. Now, ultimately, yes, I do want Tyreek Hill on my contenders, but from a startup perspective, I would rather have the youth than taking the Tyreek Hill. I'm also limited on who I can trade with once I have him.
Sure.
All right, so that's principle one. The second one is I'm just trying to trade a lot. I'm trying to trade. Brian's been in drafts with me where I've have my entire column where it's none of my picks I've picked in my spot. Some leagues are easier to trade than others. Some people are more. We were just in a startup where it was a little bit more difficult to trade and move up and down the board. But a lot of times within my trades, and we'll talk about trading in a minute, but I'm trying to move up and down the board. I'm not trying to trade like 2 picks for 1 pick or 1 pick for 2 or 3 picks. I'm not as also looking to trade for or trade away rookie picks. It's more about trading up and down the board, and which goes into my third principle, which is trading and trying to get at the end of tiers. So understanding that ADP that Matt was talking about, understanding what my value of the players are in those tiers. And then if I'm at the beginning of a tier and I don't care which receiver I get, like let's use that big glob of wide receivers from 12 to 24, basically, I don't want to draft the guy at the top of the tier. I want to trade back, and just whoever you give me is fine. I don't really care. I don't have to have the sexy one at the top of the tier.
And Todd, typically from my experience, being in leagues with you, if you were at 401 and you see, 6 receivers or whatever, you're not immediately trading back to like 407. You're like you potentially go 401 to 403, and then when 403 comes on the clock, you trade back again. So you're like gathering like a third here or a third there or whatever, little
and so
pieces.
like I'll do a trade that looks like a loss. So I'll be like like you said, 401 to 403. So I'll go 401 to 403, and just kind of for sake, it might be 510 to 512. So like nobody in their right mind before the draft would make that trade. But when I'm on the clock at the 401, I don't care which of these 3 receivers I get. I'll take any of them. So I'll move back 2 spots and just give me the 2 spots later. That's perfectly fine. Because here's the thing. In like 2 weeks, or maybe we get into August, in 2 weeks, the order of those 3 receivers that everybody was so sure about is definitely changing.
You've also moved up in that second, where you've moved up in the second round, whatever, the 5th round or whatever you said, that you 510 to 512, that might be another tier cutoff. So you're going to the back end of one and then keeping in the next tier as well, instead of losing that second tiered player.
And doing that there,
this was a perfect.
You also
segue into startup trading. So let's go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, you also leave yourself open for the absolute home run outcome of you trade back a half round and you get, let's say, a third or a second, and you get the guy that you would have taken anyway. Someone else traded up, and let's say they wanted Jalen Waddle, and I'd rather have Tank Dell, and now I moved back and got the guy I'd rather have in Tank Dell and got a second on top. So you just
make your decision for you, plus some extra. Yeah, exactly.
We're talking principles here, so this can transfer over to baseball as well. I'm in a Dynasty baseball startup right now, and I just traded back a full round, and I took what I felt was like a really good trade, but I traded out of the tier, and I was thinking, okay, I'm going to trade out of the tier, but I'm going to try to trade back in at some point when a couple of my guys go. One of my guys went. I had like 5 guys that was in. One of them went. Now baseball is a little bit different because there's a little bit less material out there for like ADP. But one of my guys went, and I still easily. I traded back yet again later on because I was like, I still am going to get the guy that I want. So now whether my player decision is correct, that's another discussion. But as far as like the principle of trading back and just taking the end of the tier is really the biggest thing for me. So like, let's continue the startup trade discussion in that next segment. So Brian, this is kind of yours. So you wanted to talk about how we're valuing future picks and kind of just defining, because when we're looking at like 501, 601. What do these values mean in terms of trade? I think is kind of what we want to talk through.
Yeah, so like the first thing that I really wanted to touch on with trading future rookie picks in startup drafts, it is almost a no-win situation for a couple of reasons. Especially if you're like in round 4 or 5 and you can say, "Hey, I'm about to build this juggernaut contender." Then, maybe your draft goes sideways. Maybe you get sniped a couple times. Maybe an injury happens before the season. Whatever the case is. When you're trading with someone and you're giving away your future pick, they're more often than not, they're going to say, okay, well, yeah, your team looks loaded, dude. Like, I'm going to treat this as 111, 112, right? And you're losing value instantly and basically saying you're selling for what its peak or lowest level, I guess you could say, lowest level it's ever going to be valued wise. It's a year plus out, and they're viewing it as a 111, 112.
Your best outcome is
You can only
breaking
lose on that. You can only lose on that. Yeah, like there's no real value gain. And I've done this in the past, and I was like, man, it's so easy to like fall in love with like, oh my god, yeah, I'll trade up and get CMC and like whatever, and then CMC gets hurt and you're absolutely torn apart. You're terrible, right? And you just traded away the 102, 103. That could happen in a blink of an eye. So more than anything, I think it's you have to understand that if you are going to trade your future, I don't recommend it, but if you are, you have to at bare minimum say that when you're talking to the person, that there's this variance that it could end up being 101. So I can't treat it like 112 either. I don't necessarily say we need to treat it as 101, but it's got to at least be like a mid first.
Like 107 at worst. Yeah.
That has to be like, that has to be the threshold that we have to meet, even if we want to talk about that type of thing. I don't recommend it because I've almost always failed in doing this type of stuff. But that is the first thing that I really wanted to get off my chest is that, especially if you're doing a startup before NFL draft or free agency, roles can change. Like, what if, you're trading for, I don't know, some Achan, we'll say, and then the Dolphins end up drafting some guy that is, and everyone falls in love with and really diminishes his perceived value anyways.
Yeah.
All of a sudden I paid a first and a second or something for Achan that he's now viewed as a split time back or something like that. Like DeAndre Swift is a good example of like a few years ago, you could have thought you were putting the chips in for like the pony that was going to win a bunch of races. And then all of a sudden he's splitting time or less than that with Montgomery and then Philly and whatever else.
Yeah, so trading first is a no from me, dog.
Yeah.
I'm not about it. Like
that's the shorter route.
Yeah, I mean when I see people do it, I'm just like, man, that is tough to stomach that you're trading away a future first for this round 6 player. Let's use somebody in round 6, like even like Debo. Like Debo, I think is worth a first, but to trade away your future first at a time when you're not even positive that your team is that great is just tough to stomach, man.
I think you can trade it later. Like if you're going to trade your future, it has to be like for someone like for like a elite tier quarterback or receiver. Like if you're
trading, if you're going to like move up,
if it's like a deal to like.
Even then, it has to be a great deal for me. Yeah. Like if someone wants my early third and future first, and I get to move up and draft Joe Burrow, sure. Like that's like turns into, maybe Gibbs or Laporta and a first for Joe Burrow. Like, yeah, I'm fine doing that. It really has to be like an overwhelming, and most people aren't doing that. Most people are asking for like your third and fifth and something else. Like, so. And that's a lesson I've just learned the hard way, man. Like, Brian, you were in some early drafts with me a few years ago when I first started doing leagues with Twitter people. And yeah, that's just a lesson that I had to learn the hard way. Like, I thought, like Todd was saying, like, man, I got Josh Allen, CMC, Tyreek. I am right there. Yeah, I'm firing off this first and second, picking up another guy. And then, yeah, guys get hurt. Variance happens.
Just to counter ourselves, is there a market for zigging and being willing to put your first out there as available to the chat, saying I'm willing to move my first with the thought that I'm really only going to do a deal that's an absolute smash home run.
So you're
I've
looking
done-
for a mistake from someone, basically.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
I've done
someone's
stuff like
like,
that.
because nobody else is trading their first right now. In the leagues that the startups that I've done,
No.
literally the last 2 years, people or this year and last year, people are really not moving their first.
You're going to get undercut if you do. Yeah, that's the only way.
So-
Like they're going to be
so
like, "Oh, I
this
can
is an
give you Michael
example-
Pittman probably."
This is an example from a trade that I did after an auction startup that we did last year, but it was like a week after the startup, and I traded away Bryce Young, Jameson Williams, and my future first, and I was like a mid-type team, but I got Herbert out of it. And at the time, I was like, man, I'm definitely trading like a mid-first here. Like I don't view and I didn't make the playoffs. I missed the playoffs, but it still was a win for me. I traded a mid-first. I think it ended up being 106. So I traded 106 Bryce Young and Jameson Williams for Herbert. So like if you could maybe you need more of a home run than that because Bryce Young at the time was worth more than he is now. But you need just an absolute home run. It doesn't hurt to like throw it out there that you might be willing to move it. Doesn't mean you have to do it. You obviously don't want to negotiate in bad faith. But if you're the only one willing to move a future first, the supply and demand might work out in your favor.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'd only do it on a really good deal.
Right. And I forget which one of you made the point, but if you're going to do it and you trade up to get an elite quarterback, like even if you lose the deal, like you still got Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Jalen Hurts, like you still have, one of the top assets for the next several years. Like
I will say this.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there's times where people just say blind, or at least maybe this happened a few years ago. There's an orphan specifically that I took over a few years ago that had drafted Josh Allen and Justin Herbert. So both in the first round. So I assume they just gave up the whole kit and cool, just like gave everything up.
Yeah.
So like it's cool to say like I have Josh Allen and Justin Herbert, but if you have nothing left in terms of assets or other flexibility, again, like you're going to say, "Oh, I have these two guys," and you're going to talk about a bad team for 6 years, or you're going to end up breaking one of those guys down and getting Jared Goff plus or something like that, which might be okay for you, but for me, like it kind of eliminates the whole point of like why did you get these two guys if you don't have anything to build around them?
Yeah, and I think those strategies have kind of switched a little bit. Like 3 years ago, the productive struggle, I think Ryan McDowell coined it. That was still kind of newer, and people still kind of made fun. I mean, people do still kind of make fun of that, but they're generally idiots. But we see the 1 year punt, productive struggle. That's the most popular draft method right now, and a few years ago, a popular strategy was what you just said. Like, I'm going to trade into the top 10 and I'm going to get 2 elite quarterbacks and I'm going to build around them no matter what. And you can pull that off. But to your point, you definitely have to nail a lot of the rest of the draft. You can't swing and miss on like round 4, 5, 6. Or, I mean, you're talking about a couple of years. You just set your team back.
It's funny because you're like saying like I think like Todd, you mentioned the zigzagging, and it's like an ever evolving method that you have to stay on top of things. It's the George Kittle that we talked about from last week or a couple weeks ago where I hated him and then I love him. It's just you have to understand that, and that's why I say reading the room. I know it's kind of a cliche statement, but you have to read the room both market wise, league wise, and yourself. And I think some people sometimes get like a little too locked into like, these are my guys, this is my strategy, this is what works. Like I'm a win now guy, I'm a rebuild guy, I'm a trade all my first guy. Like it shouldn't be like every league you go in you're doing the exact same thing. To me,
So we're kind of
like that doesn't make sense to me.
So we've kind of touched on it, the punt versus the contend versus, I call it thread the needle or like productive struggle. I think in the years past, if you try to do a productive struggle, you could productive struggle. You could end up with like the 101 or the 102, or you could thread the needle and become a good team. But you didn't, to get that 101 or the 102, you didn't have to completely debilitate your roster. But in the year of Caleb Williams, you could not just have a young team and come away with the 101 or the 102. Like you had to rip your roster apart. And we talked about it throughout the year. Like, I was never willing to just completely debilitate all future value just to get one player. And so I think that the 1 year punt isn't even really a thing anymore. I think it's a 2 year punt that people are really doing.
I think it's a vicious cycle. I think a lot of people are going into a vicious cycle of a 6 year punt and a 7 year punt. And that's like the win now guys that, like, I specifically think about people in a lot of Matt's leagues that are like redraft players that are new to Dynasty that are just like, oh, you just like having the new toy, and then you sell them and get a new toy, and then you sell them and then you get a new toy. Like, that is not what the strategy is, to constantly sell guys. Like, when you hit on guys big time, like, either get great value out of it or ride that guy. But it's not just like a recycling, let's try it again. And like, I think some people look for like the validation of like nailing rookie picks. I think that's a huge pitfall for a lot of dynasty managers, where they like want to have the ego boost of like, I hit on, I'll use Treylon Burks, and that I screwed myself over pretty hard in some senses there. Like, if you say, hey, I'm smarter than everybody else, I'm going to get 25 shares of Treylon Burks, you better start getting rid of some of them too, or you're stuck with a guy that's potentially totally useless in 2 years.
So I'm going to cite this from on Twitter at Dynasty Onion. And what this account posted was, if you had the opportunity to trade a round in a startup, a round 15 pick for a late round 1 or early round 2 startup pick, round 15 for a late 1, but you weren't allowed to come in the money in year 1, would you do it?
Easy.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So the thought there is that you're trading away. Let's just assume that the 112 and the 201 are basically equal, right? If you win the league, or you come in like 111, one versus the 201, they're pretty close to equal. They're not exactly equal, but they're close. A 211 or 212 rookie pick is worth about a round 14, 15 startup pick. A 101, a Caleb, a Bijan, a Trevor Lawrence goes in the late first of a startup. So you're effectively, even just call it a round 12 with some of the value that we talked about. Round 12 for round 1 startup pick, can't come into money year 1. Would you do it? And that is really the reason why that I punt typically year 1. And I will admit, though, they are turning into 2-year punts.
That's the problem. That, like, first of all, I think a lot of people are too impatient or ego driven to lose to their friends, or they're people they see on Twitter or whatever. They want to prove people that they're good at it or smart or whatever the case is, and they have the backstop of orphaning, and that's another rampant issue that we see in Dynasty in general. Like, I can go all in, sell all my picks, blah 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 blah. I don't have to win 1 or 2 years, or if I don't win 1 or 2 years, I can say, oh, redo, try it again. And I think that is what is happening more often than not. And that's what sucks, that like you and I or us here are rebuilding, and all of a sudden the league is like semi-broken because 3 people tried winning it all, gave everything up, left.
Yeah, a lot of startups that we've done over the last year or so involve a lot of the same group of guys that we're in a group chat with. And while it's fun to mix up with new people, a very strong benefit of that is, like, I know Jake and Jacob and Gabe and me and you and Todd, we're not going to do that, right? So you can trust that you can pull off that strategy with no concerns. Whereas if, you're joining the league, one other guy and 10 strangers, and then 5 people try and pull that strategy, and then the league just folds, and you just wasted 2 years and 2 payments. Like, so it's so important to vet your league mates and know who you're playing with.
That might be Dynasty startup principle number 1, is only joining leagues that I have a good belief that it's going to last. And I know a league that I joined last year, you had to pay 2 years entry fee.
Yeah, it's becoming more popular. Pay for 2 years.
I'm really only going to be willing to join leagues like that.
To me, Well, a major red flag, as we're going off this tangent a little bit, a major red flag for any commissioner that, especially if I don't know them, if they don't have like set bylaws that they can show me like right away, like rules and collection methods and paying for future picks, et cetera, et cetera. If they don't have those things in place, even if they say they're planning on doing that, if they don't have that at the ready, it's a total no go for me.
Yeah,
And,
definitely.
and Todd, like when that was like before you really knew me at all, that was the first thing that you asked me when I was asking you about joining the league. You're like, "Can I see the bylaws?" You asked me this question and that question, and I was like, "Oh, okay." Like this is what I'm looking for someone, not just like, "Oh yeah, sure, perfect. When do we draft?" Like,
Right.
Yeah, before I joined Twitter, I was only in 2 home leagues. We did none of that shit. We never paid for future picks. We never we didn't even have bylaws really. Luckily, those 2 home leagues have stuck together. There hasn't been a lot of orphans, but that's because it's a group of friends that we know. That's different than finding a league on Twitter or social media or somewhere else. And once I joined Twitter, it was basically Dynasty Zoltan and some of these other people in our chat that essentially taught me how to play Dynasty the way we currently think of it, and now how to be a good commissioner and how to run a league. So definitely can't stress the importance of that enough.
So we're going to get into our individual strategies, and we're kind of talking punt versus contender, threading the needle. Brian, why don't you kick it off with your strategy, because I think it kind of flows into that discussion, and we can maybe talk more about some of those principles again with your strategy for this season. So these are strategies for the 2024 off season. So maybe if you wanted to, and next year, if you want to listen to the first 15 minutes, first 30 minutes, all right. But this portion, we're going to kind of be like more for this year.
specific, yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm happy to lead us off here. I mentioned how excited I am after doing some of the research for this show. The prep was interesting to say the least, just looking at some ADPs and like our most recent startup. I'm notoriously a 1-year tanker. Usually people can kind of predict like these are the guys that he's going for. I don't like being predictable first and foremost. I think that's a disadvantage in general. So I try to zig whenever I can. And I guess I had a little bit of a blind spot here, including the start that we just did. I don't hate my team, but I don't love it either. And I think if I did this following situation, I probably would like my team more. And it was definitely available to me. So I think I would try. First of all, I'm not trading my futures. I would maybe trade my futures in season, something like that, like Todd mentioned earlier. But my goal would be in wherever I am in the first round, I would want a quarterback in one of my first 2 picks. That's not groundbreaking. And this next thing probably isn't either. But in our most recent startup, 12 receivers, including Marvin Harrison Jr., went in the first 3 rounds. And that's a pretty sharp group, a running back averse group in general, somewhat tight end even, like because they saw the value. So that is on the safe side that you'd probably get the top 12 receivers in the first 3 rounds. So I think you could get a quarterback either round 1 or 2 that's elite, and 2 top 12 receivers in the first 3 rounds. I think that's a no-brainer start.
So give us an example, give us
Yeah.
an example of like kind of what that one would look like for the first 3 rounds.
Let's say I had 109, let's say. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's like Caleb Williams, Anthony Richardson. We'll say one of those 2 guys. And if Burrow or Herbert drop, which I've seen a couple times, if one of those guys drops, obviously one of those guys potentially. So that would put me at 204, something like in that range. You're looking at wide receiver 3, 4, 5, 6 range. So like, I'm on Ross St. Brown, Marvin Harrison Jr. There's, depending on who you like of those guys, AJ Brown. There's maybe I don't think CeeDee Lamb probably drops there, but then you have, so we'll say I take one of those, like, like 5th or 6th receiver overall, whoever that is for you. Garrett Wilson, all those guys. Then you have another receiver run where you could go with, depending on, where you lean tendency wise, that's like Tyreek Hill potentially. That's
AJ Brown, Chris Olave.
yeah, there's like
Before what
if
I'm
you're like
calling the
super high on
God.
Nico Collins or like neighbors potentially, depending on how who you're talking to and how you feel about them. That foundation of like those first 3 guys gives you so much flexibility. You're talking about threading the needle. That is a awesome threading the needle situation that if something goes wrong or if you get sniped on a guy or whatever, something happens, you still aren't like all in on I have to win now to be a successful draft. So to me, it would be quarterback, 2 receivers in the first 3 rounds. And then I'm either looking at like if we're talking tight end premium, I'm looking potentially as in terms of tight end, like either Mark Andrews round 4, Pitts round 5. You got a bunch of guys like Kincaid, Ingram, Njoku, Kelsey, Hawk, Kittle in the 6 to 9 range. If I get one of those guys between rounds 4 and 9, it leaves me a lot of opportunity for other great values that again gives me flexibility to build out however I want to go. And I'm not going to be like giving away my roadmap basically. So like, yeah.
Let me ask a quick question. So,
Yep.
What is the benefit for you to take 2 receivers in the first 3 rounds? So you're talking about getting your quarterback in round 1 or 2. So you've taken either a Caleb Williams in round 1 or vice versa. Maybe take Lamb in round 1 and then like Kyler in round 2. But then you're getting that receiver most likely in round 3. So what is kind of the benefit of getting those receivers in the first 2 out of 3 rounds?
I think first of all, they're like receivers are very popular at the top of the board. So first and foremost, like we talked a little bit off air about like positional scarcity. There's tons of receivers that exist in the league. There's not tons of game changing receivers. And to me, like if you get like 2 of those top 12 ish guys, those are game changing guys that all have potential. Like you talked about earlier, Todd, of like, in terms of ROI, I could get like some wide receiver 1 overall seasons from either of these guys, right? So to me, quarterback foundation, that makes sense. And then if you get 2 receivers, in theory, their careers are longer, longevity wise. They're going to give you tons of points, and you're able to, and it kind of coincides with what a lot of value happens at the end of the draft or later in drafts, like devalued veteran running backs like Aaron Jones and James Conner and, less sexy like Brian Robinson or
David Montgomery, those type of guys.
Kamara, David Montgomery. Like there's countless guys that you can get in like rounds 9 plus, like I mentioned. So like I mentioned all those tight ends ending in Kittle. Like if I get one of those guys before round 9, I have tons of running backs that I like putting into a win now situation, that I also have the foundational pieces that when those running backs age out, get hurt, lose their job, whatever the case is, I have 3, 4, 5, 6 foundational pieces that I can just replace running backs. And maybe like in rookie drafts, I don't need necessarily to overdraft rookies in rookie drafts, which I never would do anyways, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. So like I can take chances on, Achane or Saquon or Etienne or Kyron Williams in the, rounds 4 to 7 range, and have that one maybe foundational, if you're really high on one of those guys, foundational running back, and then fill in with a couple other really strong guys for a year or 2 of production.
Yeah, so while everybody else is taking like Devontae Smith or DK Metcalf or whoever those receivers are in the glob, you can take your ETN, your Kyron Williams, or maybe a high-end tight end. Well, they're all taking those, but you've already gotten those 2 high-end receivers that you've built your roster around, like ARSB and AJ Brown, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's something that you can also kind of, a lot of people will devalue like guys like Debo, Stephon Diggs, Mike Evans, Amari Cooper, that instead of them being, they can give you wide receiver 1, like top 12 seasons still, but they're your receiver 3 or 4 or 5 on your team. And that's like major value add for sure again.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, the few things that I've noticed when looking at 2024 specific startup strategies, one that we've kind of touched on, and I'm not going to do a Jordan Love thing, but Jordan Love and Kyler are the two guys that stand out in round 2 to me. That Pat Mahomes and Josh Allen are the two quarterbacks I probably don't want to trade out of unless I'm getting a really great return. But if I'm like in the middle of the first and I have Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert to choose from, I don't see any difference between them and Jordan Love and Kyler. And definitely not a big difference, that's for sure. So I'm definitely looking to trade back, pick up some extra round 4 and 5 or future first, whatever. Pick up some more stuff, trade back, make those my QB1. For the first time since I've been doing Dynasty the last few years, I've always faded running backs in the first 4 rounds and looked at those guys at the bargain bin kind of guys that we just went over. This year, I think it's different. So if I'm doing a startup draft, especially if I'm not certain I'm going to do a 1-year punt, if I think there's a good chance I'm trying to contend, I want Breece Hall, Bijan, or Jahmyr Gibbs. And it's because to me, that sticks out the most of this year's group, this year's ADP in terms of positional scarcity. Now, I think a lot of people, like you said, they're just afraid to draft running backs. And I think that makes these 3 guys a major value. And their youth combined with their upside potential of over 20 points a game, combined with, what you expect them to do the next 5-6 years. A lot of people have compared them already to like our new generation of CMC, Zeke, and Kamara. Definitely can see that. So I don't want to pass those guys up at mid to end of round 2, like early round 3 is where I see them go. Like if, for example, in your startup, Bijan went 211, then Breece 301, Gibbs 302. Perfect value. I love the value there. So there's only 3 of those guys. And like, I don't like CMC and CMC definitely, and even JT, a little too old for that. Achane has way more questions than the 3 I just mentioned. Etienne, I don't think it is as good as those 3. I don't think he has 20 point plus per game upside like those 3 do. And they're younger than him. I don't know what to do with Kyron. I don't think he's nearly as good as some, though I'd treat him like Etienne. So to me, there's only a few of those guys. If you can get one, you're never going to regret it. They're going to have a lot of strong value. And I think that's going to be something that we kind of see people start to notice in terms of like, I think by like the summer, I could see those guys creeping up to like early to mid round 2, where right now they're going to half or full round later than that.
Yeah, because we get into like redraft season and they're taking those guys in the first half of a redraft league. And then it just feels clunky to be taking them in the 3rd round of a startup. So it's like they're kind of combining their redraft mentality with dynasty startup. So I think you're right. I think like July, August, there's going to be significant value gain on, you mentioned Breece, Bijan, and Gibbs probably moving up half a round to even a full round, most likely.
Yeah, and I love the value on JT too. Like if you can get him in the mid-3rd, I'm fine with that. CMC, that's a guy I'm never afraid to take. Might differ from you a little bit there, Todd, but to Brian's point, you either have to get an extreme value if you don't know your direction, or you have to be ready to say, hey, I'm going to contend because I have CMC. So it's one or the other, but I'm not afraid of taking CMC either. I think he's got a few great years left in him. But so those are like the big 5 running backs, but really the 3 younger ones to me keep your flexibility open. You can even do a 1-year punt if you can't trade them for the return you think they're worth.
So my strategy is, I didn't really realize it, but it's kind of a mesh of your all's strategies. So in round 1 this year, and I talked about it some in the startup mock that we did, but Justin Jefferson is my go-to in round 1 for this offseason. If you can get him like in the mid first, that's kind of where I'm targeting. I think I've seen him even go as late as like 8 or 9 in the first round. So really what I want to do is get Justin Jefferson round 1. And then the second round, with Kyler or Jordan Love is just amazing to me. To be able to get one of those guys in round 2, they're really, like you said, they're not that much different than Burrow or Herbert.
Yeah.
You have the opportunity that they could get that value gain that I'm looking for. I'm looking to maybe draft someone in the second that could be a first rounder next year. And I think that they easily could do that. They might even be like that by August. And from a points per game standpoint, what am I really giving up? Maybe nothing. I might be gaining points per game, even versus Lamar. Like, I'm probably going to piss some people off with that. But even versus Lamar, there's probably not that much difference.
Ty, let me ask you a question here. So you mentioned, let's say Justin Jefferson 107, right? That's like about the range, 107, 108. What if you are in a league with someone who either listens to the podcast or is Matt or whatever, where Jordan Love goes super high, Kyler, I see as like massive variance where he's like, sometimes he's at the end of round 3, sometimes he's at the end of round 1. So what if Jordan Love and Kyler go with this build where you have Justin Jefferson? Are you potentially doubling up in a real draft? Are you doubling up on receiver potentially, like who dropped? Like if like Marvin Harrison Jr. or something drops, or are you taking someone like whoever the next quarterback is, Dak or
So we're assuming basically, I'm doing this off the top of my head, like 12 QBs have basically gone roughly. And so if I'm picking at the 205, that means that I'm assuming Jefferson, Lamb, and Chase are already gone too. I'm worst case scenario sitting on ARSB, I think, if my math is correct. Worst case sitting on ARSB, I'd be okay with just taking ARSB. And I start my league with Jefferson ARSB. The other thing I'd be looking to do is make that trade up. I talk about like I'm trying to almost always trade up and down, get the end of tiers. The end of that tier is a massive teardrop to me after, let's call it Jordan Love. I'm going to just try to trade up a spot or two. I think like what we found is that there's a lot of dissension between people on whether Jordan Love deserves to be in that grouping. So there could be someone sitting at the 204 that's like, I have no interest in Jordan Love. I will happily trade back 1 or 2 spots because I wasn't going to take him anyways. Also, you mentioned reading the room. If someone took a quarterback in round 1, a lot of people don't like starting their draft quarterback. That's how I used to start all my drafts. Now I'm talking about doing Justin Jefferson round 1. I used to always start my draft just stock, quarterback, bang, bang. And a lot of people don't like doing that. So maybe I just look at the board and I say, I'm going to take the gamble. He's going to go ARSB at the 204. And Jordan Love's going to fall to me or whatever it is. And then the reason I love quarterback in round 2 is that a few years ago, round 2 quarterbacks were guys like Stafford, Russell Wilson, Tannehill. I saw Tannehill going in round 2 a few years ago. All those guys that are now old or were old and are now they're aged out. We're not drafting those types of guys in round 2 in this one. We're talking about Jordan Love, who's 25. We're talking about Kyler Murray. We're talking about Dak's not that old. He's probably on the older side, but he's still got 5 or 6 years. So there's good younger quarterbacks taking round 2, whereas before you were taking guys that were not worth it. And that's why I feel like you had to go quarterback in round 1. Now you can go Justin Jefferson in round 1.
And the thing that adds to that strategy is, so we had 3 quarterbacks really emerge last year. Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, and even Anthony Richardson. All this community needed was a game and a half from that guy. And like he's on the turn. And this year, we're even more blessed. This year, we're getting 3 Konami quarterbacks in probably the top 5 picks of the real life NFL draft that are in Caleb, Drake May, and Jaden Daniels. So, I mean, that's why to me, Pat Mahomes and Josh Allen are just a little bit different. Like they're difference makers. They're going to be for a long, long time. I don't know that Burrow and Herbert are. I don't know that Hurts is. I don't know that CJ Stroud is really. I'm not sure that. We've talked in the past few weeks about how we think he might be a little bit overvalued based on the production. So, yeah, I mean, again, if I can trade back into that second round, pick up a few more, round 4, 5, 6 picks, man, you got to look at doing that. It's going to help you out so much. It's going to leave you more margin for error later on in the draft and later on in the season, stuff like that.
Yeah, and so that gets me through round 2. So, and I really like the idea of getting another receiver in round 3. I would say Malik Neighbors is probably the guy that I'm really targeting, but it's like because I view him as probably going after Olave and AJ Brown. But Olave, AJ Brown, Neighbors, that grouping before you get to the glob. I really don't want to draft in the glob, and that's basically my strategy. My strategy is I don't want to draft in the glob. I want to take early receiver, forget about it, get a tight end. Maybe that's Kincaid, or I'm probably not going to be willing to take a Laporta as early as he's going. But I'm going to try to get one of those tight ends. If I miss on them, my draft is also it's built around really 2 things. And Matt was shaking his head because I think he knows where I was going with it. My draft is built around 2 things. I want to avoid the glob, and I want to look at Deshaun Watson in like round 4 or 5, whenever it is that he's going. Because I can get a guy that I think is going to increase value. And I talked about that's like the biggest part.
Speaking of 2-year punts, but no, yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of people agree. Probably more people agree with you on Watson in the 4th than I would. Like, to me, it's important to note that like Dak is almost always the end of that like top second tier of quarterbacks. Like he goes in the late second usually, from what I see, and then I mean, a guy that is lasted until 4-9 in your draft that went 6 picks after Deshaun Watson is Brock Purdy. Like,
yep.
I'd rather have Brock Purdy than Deshaun Watson.
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking kind of like we're trying to be a little bit player agnostic from like who's worth more than who, but like as far as like my strategy goes, yeah, if it's Purdy in round 4, okay, that's fine. So, but like another quarterback in round 4 while people are drafting the glob, and then in round 5-ish, a guy like ETN or Achan, I think is around that area, and again, while they're drafting those receivers, I'm collecting quarterback and running back or tight end. And I think the easiest thing to trade for in Dynasty is the wide receiver position. And if I've already got 2 locked in, I can always come back later and trade for, wide receiver 26 in Dynasty. Like that's a lot easier to do. Like the wide receiver 26, a lot of times isn't even worth a 1st round pick.
So, Todd, you're talking about a start of like Jordan Love, Justin Jefferson, Malik Neighbors, ETN, Jared Goff, something like that. And it's like, that's a pretty interesting start to a team for sure.
Well, yeah, you just basically described the way I started my last startup, except for I got Watson. So that's kind of how I'd like to do it. But I'm going to add some flavor to something that I want to try next draft that I do. And that's potentially to trade out of my 1st round pick and really all of my pick, or not all of my picks, but a lot of my early picks, trading back and take my 6, 7, 8, and maybe just call it my 7. Just use like 1 or 2 picks and consistently try to move it up and turn it into a 5th round pick. So like, let's say I start at the 107. I trade back from 107 to 110. And the other manager, I say, listen, I want to trade up from the 7 to the late 5th with that pick, or the early 6th, or whatever it is, 7th to 6th. Then later on, I trade with my 3rd round pick and I move back 5 or 6 spots. And I say, I want to take that 6th round pick that I moved up earlier. I want to move it up into the 5th. And I just next time I make a trade, I'm going to go with my 7th or my 6th round pick. I'm going to try to move that one up into the 5th. I want to get as many picks up into that 5th range as I can. So I just turned my 6th and my 7th into 2 5ths. That would be a huge win to me, because I think there's a gap where not only does it go from players worth a 1st to not worth a 1st, but there's also a gap where it goes from players worth a 1st to players worth like a 1st and a 2nd, or players that are worth 2 firsts. They're in like that maybe call it 4th range.
Yeah, like a great example of that. I know you don't like the glob, as you say, but like looking at your startup, 5-1 was Tank Dell, 6-12.
Tank Dell was a great value in that draft.
Yeah, 5-1 was Tank Dell, 6-12 was Terry McLaurin. I don't think you can trade Terry McLaurin in a future 1st for Tank Dell right now. I don't think anyone with Tank Dell is probably accepting that unless it's projected as an early 1st. So like you're talking about a massive tier break in less than 2 full rounds. So
Yeah, so I'm gonna basically dedicate a pick. I'm gonna go and say, all right, if I'm the 107, I've got the 707, right? With that 707, my whole mentality is how do I get this 707 turned into a mid fifth? And
Yeah.
anytime I make a trade, I'm working that pickup. And then once I've got into a spot that I'm good with, now I'm going to go back and maybe get my eighth and turn into a sixth, or my sixth and try to turn into another fifth. But that's going to be my strategy for my next draft, is just trying to tinker with that and see how I can make it happen.
I've done the semi what you're kind of describing before. It's a lot of fun. It takes a lot of work, and honestly, it takes a little bit of luck that you have the managers that are willing to wheel and deal in that league. So that's partly reading the room. But I traded my first for a second and a third, and then I think I traded the third for a fourth and a fifth, something like that, like third plus a ninth or something like that. So that I ended up having like a bunch of, I have like my receiver room is unreal. Like it was a tank year, but like I have like Garrett Wilson's like my wide receiver 3 or 4 on that team.
So let's close this out talking about one more like kind of added segment here, talking about like going full contend. Like, is that more desirable in this current market environment than doing these 1 year that turn into 2 year tanks that I've been doing? And should we try a full contend startup build? And if you're going to do it, when should you do it? At what
I think
time
it's
of the
dependent. I think it's dependent on everyone else that's in the draft with you. You can't go in and say, I'm going to do this thing, because what if 10 other people are trying to do that thing and then you miss out on an opportunity to do a rebuild? So it's like, it's one of those things that you kind of like, but what you're saying is that first 5 rounds that you kind of like laid out, or first 4 or 5 rounds, that allows you to have either route to take. And then by then you should be able to see teams that are either tanking or fully contending.
Yeah,
That's
and
where
the thing I would add to that is this kind of goes back to us all agreeing in the principles about not trading future first, is like, no matter how hard I'm contending, I let's say I draft CMC and Tyreek and Mark Andrews and I get Diggs in the round 6, right? I'm just not trading my future picks. You just don't need to have like a bye week contending team. There's no reason for it. It's the same logic that you were talking about earlier, Todd, with like Tyreek versus Olave. The difference is actually negligible on how much that point per game difference helps you win in the playoffs, etc. It's the same principle of trading your future first now. Like if you go full contend, unless you screw the draft up, your team is going to look like a contender after the draft, whether you trade that future first or not. So I'm just not touching it. Like you said, like we all agreed on, save that bullet for in season if you need it, injury insurance, all that stuff. But I will say I generally agree with your point, Todd, and I'm approaching every draft like trying to stay flexible, but I'm going in planning to win. I'm not going in planning to do a 1 year punt. I'm going to try and draft a team that I think is going to be competitive in 2024. And then stay flexible. I'm willing to switch up that strategy as early as round 2.
Yeah. To Todd's point, it's definitely the sexy thing to rebuild now for a year, like 1 year punt, productive struggle. That is definitely more and more prevalent.
2018, 19, 20, I was doing startups in all those time frames. You could build a really solid, good team and get the 101. It wasn't that difficult. In 2020 or 2021, I did a 1 year tank in a league with some good managers from Twitter, and I turned it around the next year. I was in the championships. Like it just like it wasn't even hard. It was like I got Breece Hall. And then bam, I was a contender.
And it's very rare that nowadays, to our point, you almost never see someone in the middle of a startup, let's say round 10, and they got 4 future surplus first. That almost never happens anymore. And 2-3 years ago, it was pretty common. There was one guy that was able to do that. If you can still do that, if you're in a home league or, if you're playing with a different crew than we obviously play with, yeah, definitely try that strategy because it's almost fucking foolproof. But
Yeah.
everybody noticed the benefits of it over the last couple of years.
So I'm going to make a commitment to a startup probably in the post NFL draft timeframe. So like around May, probably in May, maybe early June, when rookie hype is at its peak, when people are just enthralled with the rookies, when they're going to get driven up startup draft ADP.
Yeah.
And before we get to redraft season, once you get to redraft season, if you're drafting to contend, you're kind of behind the eight ball, in my opinion. In rookie draft season, I'm gonna commit to drafting a win now all in contender, taking guys like CMC, taking like the Devontae Adams, taking like a win now approach. I'm not gonna trade my future first, like we're talking about. I'm not gonna also like I'm not gonna take bad value. I'm just gonna take the good value of the good player, of the good win now players, like a CMC, willing to take early running backs, things like that. And I'm going to see how it shakes out, because I really have never done one like that. I've done teams where I semi tried to win, like thread the needle, and then either win it,
but you leave yourself an escape hatch.
Yeah, and I've never like actually gone full tilt all in. Let's go try to win this year. And I'm going to do that in rookie draft season.
Yeah, we've kind of thrown the idea around about, doing a league with some of our listeners. So maybe that's not a bad one to look at later this summer.
So great.
That's the problem, yeah.
All three of us are doing the same thing. That one for later on, but hey, honestly,
some random listener ends up with 6 first-round picks because we're all just like tossing away to play win now.
Dude, rookie hype gets so hot that time of year, to your point, Todd. You can straight up tell the rest of the league what you're planning on doing and still pull it off. Like there is a sweet spot, like you said, in between the rookie hype and the, oh shit, points are going to matter this year's season. Yeah, definitely agree with that.
I'm dying. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I'm dying for a startup now. I've been very disciplined. I think this is the moment that I need to have one more before our Dynasty Market Watch League.
You guys just did one like a few weeks ago?
Yeah, but I screwed that one up. That's what we were saying. Matt. So I didn't screw it up, but I don't love how it went. I want to try something.
No, I hear you.
And I think that's
stay flexible, apply your values.
It's easier said than done. Yeah.
One of my home leagues that's been around for about 4 years or so. We're actually going to do a redraft of the entire league this year because we have decided as a group that it is too lopsided. There are too many behemoth teams, and there are too many teams that are just straight fucked for no better.
Did people have to buy themselves out like that? That's what I would require if I was
the first thing I ever did was a bunch of people that didn't know Dynasty, and then 2 people that did, and that's kind of how the league turned out. That ended up being like no orphans, but like a 6-team dispersal draft. It was just outrageous, like half the league dispersal with no one leaving.
And shout out our friend Nick, woman lover, and my friend Shade. They have the 2 best teams. I have the 3rd best team, but it's definitely worse than their 2 teams. And they were magnanimous.
You're doing a redraft.
They were magnanimous about it. They said that this definitely fucks us over, but let's for the health of the league long term. Let's redraft this, because there's some teams that are straight like.
I'm
the best dynasty player in the world could take over one of these teams, and they won't have them in the playoffs in the next 4 years. Like that type of fun. So it's either that or fold the league. We made the right choice. Shout out 2K3 League.
All right, that wraps us up. Thank you for joining Dynasty Market Watch, presented by Bulletproof Family of Podcasts. We're going to continue to be back every week this offseason. After the NFL Combine, we're going to start hitting on more of the late round rookies, guys after that first round. We want to see some of that draft capital and kind of get an idea using grinding the mocks and other resources to understand kind of what that draft capital is going to look like. So after the NFL Combine here in a few weeks, we'll start hitting those rookies. You can find Brian on Twitter at Brian_O'Leary1. Matt is at Dynasty Peasant. I'm Todd at Dynasty SFlex. And you can find me in the Bulletproof Discord. Would really help if you could rate and review the podcast. Don't forget to go find us in the Bulletproof feed and listen there. Thanks for joining.
Cherish Al Horford.